Yeah, as Mike mentioned a while ago, I work for NERC, and that instantly, in some people's mind, that makes me the enemy or something. Whenever I was asked to speak here, I was really not sure what the event organizers thought about me and everything until I found out this great opportunity they gave me to try to summarize CIP 3 through 9 in one slide in 5 minutes. So they definitely like me, or they think I'm Superman or something. But this basically, I have another slide that I only had a couple months to prepare a slide, so I can email this to you, but I decided not to bring my computer up and try to connect it. What I want to say is, it's real challenge. This part for me is challenging to try to summarize CIP 3 through 9 in one slide. Even just hitting some of the high points of what was said today and some of the discussions we had within one slide in a few minutes is just a daunting task, let alone putting myself back in the entity role and saying I'm going to create a program, especially from scratch, that actually meets the requirements and is sustainable and satisfies the my own internal constraints, like lack of manpower, lack of time, lack of any other resources like money. But there's just a few philosophical points I wanted to bring up, 3 or 4 things that I think will kind of help give you an idea of this world according to Steve Applegate in a way that you can possibly reach a sustainable and compliant environment, a secure environment. I'm going to go deeper into some of this later. I'll have a few slides later after the break. First, and I guess I need to throw out the disclaimer, I'm speaking for myself. I've only been at NERC for about 2 months, so I haven't been given the keys from Jerry Cawley to speak for NERC yet. Maybe in a couple more months I'll be speaking for NERC, but right now I'm speaking for Steve. The first thing I want to say is that it's very obvious, I'm probably speaking way below the level of the people in this room, but baking in security is a way to think of this and not retrofit. It's a whole lot easier we already have kind of mentioned this today, even in the short time I've been in here, we've talked about doing things right the first time instead of coming back later and trying to take some environment you already created and trying to make it meet CIP requirements or any kind of cybersecurity standards that you want to bring out. The second one I want to say is that you shouldn't strive for compliance. I know it sounds kind of funny to hear coming from somebody from NERC, don't strive for compliance. But compliance is the lowest bar, right? I mean, whenever I was an auditor, we didn't come in and say, wow, they just barely made compliance. That's awesome, good job. We always were very impressed with somebody that hit the ball out of the ballpark instead of coming in and saying, wow, you just barely met the minimum. That could be an issue. So just like the whole, a batter that's on deck and swinging 2 bats, then when you get up and you're ready to actually try to hit the ball and you got 1 bat, it's a lot easier. So compliance is not your goal. Your goal is security, and then compliance is going to come naturally as a part of that. I've heard that mentioned a couple times today. 3, resource, and I'm sorry, this doesn't even match this. I apologize. These are kind of the questions, some of the ideas of questions that you may be asking, but I don't really have the slide. So the third thing I want to bring up is dedicate resources. It's a problem, huge problem, I think, in the industry. In the old days, security, I was doing security as probably you could even say in the 80s, okay? In 1989, I was doing, back then, cybersecurity was cryptography pretty much only, and then the rest was relegated to physical. But at one point, and really up until about the last decade, security was just an additional duty of a system administrator or network admin. And that paradigm doesn't work anymore. Even for a small organization, if you really have to have dedicated people, that's their job, and they also need to be that check and balance, like I was mentioning, and the question I had for Josh about his presentation. It's really critical. It's a key component to have a check and a balance. If you have if you have information technology professionals, and you really have a great secure environment, and you're real happy with it, but the IT professionals can do anything they want unchecked and can erase their tracks. And you might even have IT security people that are somewhat dedicated or completely dedicated, but they report to the same boss as your IT, the whole IT shop, maybe the CIO. Everybody reports to the CIO, and there's a huge conflict of interest there. As a vulnerability gets uncovered, the same person looks bad, either way. So it's provides a negative incentive, I guess you could say. So I believe that it's real important to lay out your organization so that there's even possibly up to C-level executives, the security and IT are separate. last thing I guess I was going to throw in there for philosophy is look backwards in time. Very common mistake. You know, an entity could have a really well laid out organization when we walk in there, but as a CIP auditor, whenever I was doing the auditing side, you know, we look at what you have today, then we say, okay, now show evidence back through the date that you had to be compliant with that particular thing. So very common mistake. People, you know, consider it as a snapshot. Like get compliant the day, you know, the day before the compliant auditor shows up, and then we're okay. But consider it, you know, log everything and consider everything you're doing today is going to be audited at some day in the future.
Yeah, you know, going back to the organization thing, you know, do you think that the senior managers have some security qualifications, or do you think that, you know, we should elevate the, I guess, the level that security is at? Because they're always like buried in the organization. They're never.
Yeah.
And I think that caused a big problem. I'm just curious what you think about that.
That's a really good point. There's got to be, you know, I don't want to say there's, you know, you have to have a technical security expert or something at a C level or something like that, but there's got to be a whistleblower kind of, you know, freedom. I have half a slide later talking about that, but there's got to be some sort of a safety zone where people feel like they can do the right thing and not get penalized for it. Yeah, so however you do that is, there's a million different ways to slice it.
I mean, what about doing it with the standards themselves? Because I think what happens, and this doesn't happen in my company, but I think what happens at other companies is that, you know, they're scared to even go talk to the senior manager about, you know, everything is fine, basically. They're always telling them everything is fine until it's not fine because they're scared of, you know.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, totally. My last slide today is going to be talking about culture of compliance, and one of the things I've got, I don't know how many anecdotes I could bring up right now. You know, one time I was told early on in the days when Wi-Fi was still a buzzword, and wow, what does it mean? Are we actually going to have a wireless way of communicating? You know, quite a while back, my boss had said to me, "Hey, what do you think of this wireless?" And I said, you know, being the paranoid person I am, I said, "Boy, that opens up a lot of new vectors, you know, for an attacker to get in." And they said, "Well, how so?" And so I went out and did a little study, and just without being an expert in 802 or 802.11 or anything, I went out and did whatever studying I could do, came up and had a nice risk assessment I presented. And this particular individual looked at it and said, "We already had wireless, by the way." You know, they said, "Oh, cool, there's something new and neat we can go by." They didn't look at security the typical kind of way that people have done in the past. So they implemented a bunch of stuff and then asked me, "Hey, what do you think of security?" You know, way after the fact for being the ISO for the company. But when I produced this product or this deliverable and showed them, you know, several different very serious vulnerabilities, the answer to me was, I cannot give this, you know, to my boss. I can't give this to the director, or else I'm going to look like an idiot. Now, dumb it down. I wanted like the three worst ones. So I weeded out and I tried to quantify them. I come up with 3 really good ones. They said, "Gosh, these sound too bad. Make it sound a lot less dangerous." So I had to come back. After the 8th iteration, it just said basically, "Hey, there's this very far-fetched scenario that maybe we could be hacked somehow, someday, if, you know." So that was a problem. For one thing, I had no incentive to try to, you know, blow the whistle and do the right thing, because I would have gotten, I don't know about fired. You know, it depends on what conspiracy model you're going to follow, but at least I definitely wouldn't have got. That's absolutely, yeah. Okay, yeah, sure. Right. And on top of that, the fact that cybersecurity was built into the grant program, you know, that's whenever the early smart grid work I've done, you know, I've only done some very high level work, but the stuff I did was for an entity that said to me, you know, "We want to apply for this grant. What do we think about the security?" And we had to build a risk assessment and all that before we turned it in. So I think the federal government did a great job on that. It's a good point. Okay, so I just thought of an idea basically, and this is, a person could take this idea I've got and really get something useful out of it if you're an entity. And that is, I tried to think of common pitfalls from each of the CIP standards that I think people make. It'd be a great thing to talk to Josh about anytime. You probably have his email address, or talk to some people that have been involved in audits, especially when you get into the 10s and 20s and 30 audits, because that's a whole bunch of them. And you can all feel free to holler at me. I don't know exactly how much I can talk about it. I can't get very detailed about some of these, but I believe there's also been statistics published about the most common vulnerabilities within each of the standards. But first one is CIP 2. What I'd like to say, an RBAM, everybody's probably heard of that, risk-based assessment methodology. Well, don't consider the R as the word risk the way that you traditionally think of it. Think of it in terms of impact. It's really an impact assessment, because if you go in and you do this threat times the likelihood and all this type of stuff and coming up with what you would, a person that gets their CISSP, the way they understand the word risk is not the way that's used in that standard, because you have to assume that the thing has already been, that the worst case scenario has already happened. So something dumb, think of it as, are there impacts? That's your R. That's not risk, it's R. So second thing, CIP 3, the buck can only have one stop. It's a good way to think of this, okay? This is a very common thing. I don't know how many people I've talked to from other regions that said, oh yeah, it seems like every time that we go somewhere, they do have more than one senior manager. Okay, so the buck has to stop with one person. You can make delegates, that's fine, it's within the rights of the standards, but there's one piece of it that you can't delegate, and it always has to go to the senior manager that's the main person, and that is the authorization for the cybersecurity policy. So is that something, Josh, did you see a lot of that, where a person would have a delegate, whatever you call it, a delegated person approve the cybersecurity policy annually or whatever? That doesn't work. That's a very common mistake. CIP 4, I said keep your eyes on the third parties. So again, this was mentioned today, talking about janitors and getting training and background checks and things. Also, appropriate use of CCAs particular. So you could have this great, cybersecurity training that you purchase from somebody or you build your own, and it just really seems to cover everything. But you don't mention your particular cybersecurity, critical cyber assets, and then you walk away with a possible violation out of the deal. So you have to very specifically mention your critical cyber assets and what type of usage is appropriate, and ideally separate it per the individual, like we were talking about. An operator, is going to have a different scope than a system administrator, and if you have separate trainings, that's great. I've never personally seen a violation or a potential violation where the same set of training was used for everybody. I've complained about it. I've said, how could you give the janitor the same training you give the system admin? That doesn't work. Janitor may not have any interest in any of that at all besides the physical piece. But so I've had some recommendation kind of things, but I've never seen personally a violation. But I have seen it where a beautiful security plan I was very impressed with, but just didn't happen to mention their cyber assets, or critical cyber assets, and how to deal with them. CIP 5, I say let the buffalo roam, not your laptops. Okay, if you haven't heard of the whole roaming laptop idea, the idea is anytime, let's say that you have a laptop, or you have substation engineers or somebody that has a laptop that's used to manage equipment that possibly doesn't have any kind of interface of its own. So like a PLC or something, or what's another good example? A relay, a Schweitzer relay. Okay, they're going to plug into this probably and manage it with some kind of a laptop. Well, that laptop needs to reside within your cybersecurity, your perimeter, your ESP. If you take it outside the ESP and you go to Panera Bread and you do something with it and take it home, that happens to be, let's say you just give it to that person and they don't have it dedicated for that. As soon as you take it outside, bring it back in, plug it back in. Now it's a new device being introduced into your ESP. So before you plug it back in, you have to go through all the same stuff, and just like you're treating it like a brand new device. So that's a huge one. I know there's been a lot. There's probably going to be a CAN written on that or something, I believe. I've heard so much discussion back whenever I was on the regional entity side. CIP 6, this one I couldn't think of one that really popped out in my head as being a very common mistake that people make, but it's, in most ways, from an altruistic standpoint, it's the most important of all of them. You're talking about, anything that you put in on the cyber world can be undone if I can touch the box. I mean, that might be a little bit of a bold statement, but just a bit, you can take, again, talking about backtrack. You have a great device and you walk in with a CD and boot it into a different way, and you can probably download take an image of the entire hard drive, take it off site, and if it's even if it's whole disk encryption, you could spend unlimited time trying to crack the encryption. So physical security is key. I think the only thing I would throw out there is maybe the logging is a problem. It's back to that same thing. You have to log ingress and egress, and you got to be real serious about that. I've seen a few places where somebody said that this is a 6-wall boundary, but it ended right at the false ceiling, a drop ceiling. So you got to think in terms of sheetrock can keep somebody out in terms of a good physical security perimeter. Now in real life, if you had on the other side of that wall, you had something that, like a stash of diamonds, or you had something that was really essential you did not want stolen, you'd have concrete or something. But the idea behind this is not necessarily that it's got to be Fort Knox. The idea is if someone was to break in, it would be obvious. So if I take a pocket knife and cut through sheetrock and climb through in the night, and there's no cameras facing there, and I can get out and what am I going to do, mud it and paint it before the morning? So hypothetically, the awareness is going to be there for somebody. I haven't really gone into that discussion. I'm not sure. So far, there's, yeah. I've heard some great discussions about that dealing in terms of armored fiber. So there's certain kinds of fiber that if you mess with it, it becomes obvious, because that's one of the things. Fiber, you can the way I understand it. Again, I don't work on the compliance side, so but the way I believe is, as you have fiber that's leaving PSP, it's as long as it's encrypted or has a firewall on each end and stuff like that, it can be delimited that way. But I've heard people talk about, is a 6-wall boundary, the shell or whatever you want to call it that goes around the fiber, is that 6 walls? It's enclosed. Yeah, exactly. Okay, CIP 7, there's a bunch of pitfalls in CIP 7. The most common one I've seen is people that don't test adequately. And in terms of, if I was an EMS administrator, the most critical thing to me would be seeing that the functionality is not affected whenever I go and put some change in. But very specific to the standard is that the cybersecurity controls don't change. You're not even required, by the CIP standards to test the change. I mean, to see if a change affects the actual functionality. Obviously, you want to do that too, but cybersecurity controls are what you have to focus on. Also, I threw in there firmware and network appliances. When you're talking about patching, instantly everybody goes to Patch Tuesday Microsoft. That for some reason it's almost synonymous with the word patch. But cybersecurity updates are issued for a whole plethora of things, including Cisco, iOS, and everything. You don't have to care about every update to every piece of software, like a BIOS update to your PC or whatever, unless it's particular to fix a problem dealing with cybersecurity. And then at that point, I haven't seen this necessarily as a pitfall, but it's kind of something that a lot of people don't think about. But your patch management program has to take into consideration any patch that's dealing with cybersecurity. CIP 8, if your exercise must be based on your plan. I've seen a lot of people that exercise something and say, here, that was an exercise of incident response. Let's just call that our annual exercise. But it didn't actually test their own plan. So your exercise has to actually exercise your plan. That's particularly troublesome. And the last one is CIP 9. There's two things here that were kind of competing in my mind. The first one is that you got to deal with recovery of CCAs. A lot of times, people were interested in recovering the function of a control center or the function of some operational center, but they weren't interested in recovering the actual critical cyber assets. So when you're all done, at the end of the day, you've built this scenario and had adequate paranoia. Sorry, now I can talk quieter because the air just went off above my head. You've got this great paranoia. You got a bunch of people sitting around a table, and they're all throwing out all these different scenarios for hurricanes and whatever else. At the end of the day, the plan that you build has to deal with recovery back to the capability you started with. And if the capability you started with is also a backup facility, and you end up with one facility but not the other, you have to somehow at least account for, okay, then what are we going to do? We're going to build a new facility as needed, or you have to somehow address going back to the original capability, which included a hot and shadow or hot and standby, or however you want to call it. Okay, that was it for this slide that you don't see. And again, feel free to email me. I'm Stephen.applegate@nerc.net is my email address. Say that real quick so that nobody writes it down. No, I really, for real, I don't have any problem with responding to anybody's emails. Again, I'm not on the compliance side. I'm not your enemy. Nobody at NERC is. And as I talk about this a little bit later, you'll hear a little bit more about how we're kind of laid out. Again, I'm not speaking for NERC as far as Jim. He's over there taking really strong notes. He's gonna haunt me later. No. Last thing I want to say is there you go. Yeah. It's misspelled, I think. No. Contrary to FDR's famous quote, I would say that the only thing we have to fear is the lack of fear itself. Okay, and I'm not talking necessarily about the CIP standards or fear of not being compliant. I'm talking about that there's a real paranoia that you need to have, and this paranoia has to be articulated, and it has to be sold to everybody in your organization that matters. All the way up the chain. Even if to this point in time you've never done anything about cybersecurity, it's not been your role. You need to sell this when you get back, because without this, sufficient paranoia, you're not going to get the budget. You're not going to be able to overcome, the board of governors, whatever it is that you're dealing with at your organization. There's no silver bullet for any of this. It takes defense in depth, that whole approach of layers of security in order to get past compliance and to get past the imminent threats. So with that, I guess is there any questions? I'm sorry. We're going to take a 10 or 15 minute break, I think. I may be able to recover a little bit more lost time, and then we'll get started on beyond CIP on the next part. So, all right, thanks a lot.